The world of the classical Mediterranean was home to many different prophets, seers, and oracles, probably the most famous being the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi, where the ancient Greeks thought the center of the world was located. Quite possibly, though, the most frightening of them all was the Oracle of Trophonius, located at Labadeia in Greece. This oracle is relatively well attested in our ancient sources, but unfortunately, our only really in-depth account comes from the writing of Pausanias, who claims to have visited this oracle, and specifically our information comes from Book 9 of his description of Greece, written in the 2nd century AD. This is, however, not a perfect guide because, as so often happens, the site in question has been used and built over since antiquity. The majority of these sites dotted around the Mediterranean featured an oracle, a figure, normally a woman, through whom the god of the shrine in question would speak. The Oracle of Trophonius, however, was evidently something rather different. When a supplicant wished to consult with this particular oracle, they were apparently able to communicate with Trophonius directly, that is to say, without the use of a medium, and they were able to experience the trances and the visions themselves, which were then recorded, because after the trances ended, the visitor was said to have no memory of them. There are several competing myths about Trophonius, but the most detailed tells us that he was the son of the god Apollo, although he was raised as the son of Erginus, who ruled Orchomenus, an ancient city-state and one of the richest archaeological sites in modern-day Greece, at some point in the distant past, and that Trophonius had a mortal brother named Agamedes. The two brothers constructed the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and according to legend, they also built the treasury of Hyrcanus, king of Boeotia. When they built this, they devised a very clever trick. One of the stones in the wall was placed in such a way that it could be removed, allowing the brothers to sneak in and essentially rob the place blind. But Hyrcanus eventually caught on, and he laid a trap to catch them. Agamedes was caught in a snare, and Trophonius decapitated him to protect his brother's identity. According to Pausanias, the earth then opened up and swallowed the pair whole, and the location where this happened in Labadeia was forever after known as the Pit of Agamedes. Evidently, this was forgotten by the Labadeians for some time until, after suffering the effect of a long-term drought, they consulted the oracle at Delphi, who told them that they needed to find the god in their midst and seek aid from him. Subsequent searching for this god was unsuccessful until one of the envoys who had gone to Delphi, a man named Saon, apparently saw some bees and followed them to the pit of Agamedes, and upon entering it, met the god Trophonius. Realizing that it was Trophonius they had been looking for, the Labadeians were cured from the drought that had been afflicting the land, and they established a cult dedicated to him, who was worshipped as their local god and their protector, and eventually, the site was home to one of the many oracles of the classical Mediterranean. The archaeological evidence we do have for a cult here appears to be established by at least the 5th century BC, maybe a century earlier, and this appears to have some confirmation in the writing of Herodotus, but beyond that, it's not entirely certain. And although archaeological work has not really been conducted since the mid-20th century at the site, future work might help clarify these dates. In any case, this is where things take a frightening and actually a fairly mysterious turn. Typically, oracles in the Greco-Roman world were consulted and their visions and prophecies interpreted by the priests or by the inquirers themselves, and although it was believed that the gods spoke through the oracle in question, those oracles, or a visitation to them, do not necessarily appear to have been considered particularly life-threatening or dangerous. The Oracle of Trophonius, however, was a different sort of experience, and it became an expression in the classical world for extreme levels of fear. If one wanted to consult the Oracle of Trophonius, they had to arrive at the site several days before actually convening with the oracle. The supplicant was required to sleep in a special building dedicated to the deities of good spirit and good fortune, while eating only meat which came from the oracular sacrifices, and the supplicant was required to bathe in the river Hercina, named after Trophonius' daughter in order to purify themselves, with hot baths being forbidden. Several animals, including, finally, a ram, would be sacrificed over a pit, and the spirit of Agamedes would be called upon while doing so. At each sacrifice, a diviner or a priest of Trophonius would be present, and they would examine the entrails of the sacrifices. The state of the organs would tell the individual looking to consult the oracle whether or not Trophonius would grant them a good reception. This would be done on the night that the supplicant would seek to enter the cave of Trophonius, and only if the entrails of the ram matched the entrails of the previous sacrifices would they be permitted to do so. When the entrails signified that they were ready, he or she bathed in the river, and then they were anointed with oil by 2 boys of about 13, and were led by those boys not to the cave of Trophonius, but to 2 fountains, one of which contained the waters of forgetfulness, and the other of which contained the waters of memory. They would drink from the waters of forgetfulness to wipe their mind of everything that has weighed upon it up till now, and then they would drink from the waters of memory to remember everything they were about to witness as they descended to meet Trophonius. After drinking, the priests brought out some sort of an image. It's not known exactly what this was, but it was claimed that the image was made by Daedalus, the architect who built the famous labyrinth of Greek myth, and it was then worshipped in some manner. There is a type of wooden carving dating to the Archaic Age which was known in classical Greece as a zoanon, and Pausanias refers several times throughout his work to this object, so it's possible that this is what was worshipped at the Oracle of Trophonius, but we do not know that for certain. Special clothes were then donned, and the individual was led to the sacred grove, above which, on a mountain, was the pit of Agamedes and then the Oracle of Trophonius. Once there, they entered some sort of a man-made pit, at the bottom of which was the entrance to the cave, which would be entered by lying flat on their back, placing their feet in the entrance, and after their knees were past the entrance of this cave, apparently the individual would be sucked or pulled in with great force. Some ancient sources refer to this as a descent into the underworld, and after some time, the supplicant apparently spoke not to any sort of an oracle, that is to say an intermediary between the supplicant and the god, but to the god Trophonius himself. When this was done, they emerged from the cave, feet first, just as they had entered it, and the attendants of the oracle only came to retrieve them when they finally heard screams. Apparently, those who went to this cave emerged mad, babbling incoherently and shrieking, and it is for that reason that this place was sometimes called the Cave of Nightmares. They were then led to a special chair, called the Throne of Memory, and the ravings were recorded. Afterwards, they were brought back to the building where they began their journey, and eventually their faculties returned. The lengthy account given in Pausanias is not just a one-off thing. Our records of the Oracle of Trophonius and the associated cave, along with much else, comes down to us from Aristophanes, Cicero, and Herodotus, to name just 3 others. So what was this place? What could cause such a reaction in people, or is it nothing more than just a story from antiquity? Well, we do know that the overall site existed. It's actually a protected site in modern Greece, and it initially underwent excavation in the 1960s, but this is complicated by the fact that, since classical antiquity, the site has been used right up to the modern day. Because of that, it has been difficult to pinpoint aspects of what has come down to us in the textual sources. As of right now, unfortunately, we don't know where the Pit of Agamedes and thus the Cave of Trophonius was located. It is entirely possible that it's beneath one of the buildings that currently exists here, but it's also entirely possible that, because it was a pit and a cave, it has since been filled in and essentially lost. But we don't know for certain. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of the site, barring further archaeological work. That being said, what could the Cave of Trophonius actually have been? What would induce such terror among people that it became a common enough phrase among the Greeks and the Romans? There are maybe 2 possibilities. Pausanias, among others, mentions that honey cakes would be given to the supplicant to take as an offering. So it might be possible that they would have been given drugs or some sort baked into these cakes, which would produce a high and induce some sort of a trance, similar perhaps to the Delphic oracle. The other possible explanation is that, because this was located in a small cave at the bottom of a pit, it may be a naturally occurring example of a sensory deprivation chamber. The cutting off of the senses, combined with a fear of caves in Greek mythology and Greek culture, might have led to hallucinations as the brain was forced to create images of its own to make up for the sensory deprivation. This would certainly help explain the state of the individuals as they left the cave of Trophonius, but once again, pending further archaeological work, this is really all just speculation. Be that as it may, as of right now, the jury is still out both on the location of the cave and why it induced such terror in individuals, but perhaps one day, that mystery will be solved.